Greetings, computer science enthusiasts, and today we're going to talk about for loops. So a for loop is basically a way to iterate through, and iterate is just a fancy word for repeat through a certain coding sequence over and over and over again until you don't want to do that anymore. The for loop is most commonly used when you know or can figure out how many times you want the repetition to occur. So let's look at the individual parts of a for loop. So I've put a for loop block up here on the screen in the workspace. I've pulled up my console window so that we can see the output down here, so that we'll be able to see what it is that our code is doing. I don't have any code inside the for block, so let's put some code in there. Let's just drag over console.log and let's put in the message, hey. So I'll just put in a quick hey here. And then in this particular iteration, or in this particular version of the for loop, it's going to iterate 4 times. So I should see hey appear on the screen 4 times. We'll go ahead and run that, and you'll see, sure enough, that inside loop executes 4 times. Let's examine the parts of the for loop and learn why that happens. So the first part of the for loop is basically creating a variable that your for loop is going to use. It's very common to see the variable I created, and it's very common to see its initial value set to 0. So var I equals 0 means we're creating a variable I and we're setting it equal to 0. The second part of your for loop is always a Boolean conditional. It will always return true or false. When it's true, we get to do what's inside the loop and move on to the next step. When it's false, we don't get to do what's inside the loop and we just move on to the next part of our code. And then finally, the last part of the for loop is an incrementer. It tells us how we're going to be changing that variable over and over again as the loop does its thing. You might not have seen the I++ notation before. I++ just means take whatever value is in I and add 1 to it. And then that's your new value of I. It's the same thing as I is equal to I plus 1. All right, so using the parts of this for loop, instead of printing out the word hey, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out the value of that variable I. And I think I'm going to do it from I is less than 3, and then we'll kind of explore. So we know that this loop is going to run 3 times. Think about what would print out each time the loop runs and see if you can't get it right. So I'm going to go ahead and reset, and then I'm going to run. And sure enough, it prints out 0, 1, and 2. Now, why is that? Well, when we initially create I, we assign it a value of 0. 0 is less than 3. That's a true statement. That means enter into the body of the loop and do whatever it says. In this case, we're printing out the value of I. That value was 0. We print out a 0. Then after we're done, we go to the incrementer and do what the incrementer says. And in this case, the variable I is going to be changed by applying the plus plus concept to it, which means just increase I by 1. So 0 increased by 1 goes to 1. Once I've done that, I go back and check and see if the conditional is still true. I, which is now 1, less than 3, is still true. So then we go inside the block and we print out the value of I, which is now 1. Once we've done that, we go back to our incrementer. It'll change I to 2. 2 is less than 3 is true. I print out the 2. Go to the incrementer and it increments I to 3. And lo and behold, here's where we find out that we no longer have a true condition. Because 3 is not less than 3. That's false. So that means we're not going to do anything else, and we'll just finish. The loop is done. There's no more incrementation. There's no more printing what's in or doing what's in the body. We're just done, and we're moving on sequentially to the next part of our program. So that's why it printed out 0, 1, and 2. You know, the loop runs 3 times. It maybe seems like I should have wanted to count 1, 2, and 3 instead of counting 0, 1, and 2. So how would I change this code up so that I could count 1, 2, 3? Well, there are a couple of different ways you could do that. One way would be to change where you start I. So if I want the first number to print out and I'm printing I, let's start I at 1. So if I want the first number to be 1, I'll start I at what I want it to be if I'm printing I. And then inside this loop, instead of I less than 3, let's change the conditional. So I'll go to math and I'll pull out a different conditional. I'm going to pull out the conditional less than or equal to. And I can say I is less than or equal to 3. And that will allow 3 to be a true solution for this equation. So now I'm going to start printing at 1. 1 will work, 2 will work, 3 works. It's 4 that breaks the loop. So now when you go ahead and run this code, you get 1, 2, 3 down here at the bottom instead of 0, 1, 2. So by modifying the numbers that govern what your I is inside your loop, you completely change your output. A good rule of thumb to follow is how many times will this loop run? You just take the difference of these two things, and that usually tells you how many times the loop runs if it's a less than symbol. If it's a less than or equal to symbol, it's going to be one more than the difference. So that might be a little bit too much at this point. You can just run the loops right now and count and see how many times it runs and see if you can figure it out ahead of time. And if you can't, with practice, you'll get better at it. All right. So I've talked about how to print out numbers in increasing order. What if I wanted to reverse that process? What if I wanted to start out with, let's say, 3 and have it count down to say 1? I want to do like a countdown, 3, 2, 1. All right. So what we're going to have to do is if I want to start at 3, we're going to have to change the start. You could write an algorithm in here that would be a little bit more complicated, and I could leave this completely alone, and I could write code in here that would do it. But I think an easier way would be, let's use the tools of what's going on with our for loop and write a countdown. So if I want the first number to print out to be 3, I just change that to a 3. All right. And now when I run this, you can see 3 prints out. However, 3 less than or equal to 3 is true, but then this goes up to 4. And I want it to go down to 2. So instead of adding 1 each time, I want to subtract. Now, I could drag in the I equals, I could drag in 2 of these yellow blocks and make it I is equal to I minus 1, but there's an easier way. So there's a decrementer. Now, in dragging these blocks, they don't have a decrementer block. You don't see the I plus plus or the I minus minus over here, but I can go to show text, and then I can change those pluses to minuses. And then I can go back to show blocks, and it changes it to the minus minus block. Now I will reduce in value by 1 instead of increase. So we call this a decrementer instead of an incrementer. You got to be very, very careful when you do this, because if I start out at 3 and then I want it to be true when I is less than or equal to 3, and I go 3, and then I go 2, and then I go 1, and then I go 0, and I go -1. These are all still true because my condition in here was I less than or equal to 3, and I'm subtracting from 3 each time. I will never get a false statement. If 3 is the biggest number I can get and I keep changing the number to where it's smaller and smaller, it's always going to be true that I is less than 3. If you do this in GameLab just freezes up. It's an endless loop. It's called a runtime error, where the syntax of your program is fine, but then when you actually run it, it doesn't do what you thought, and it usually causes some problem for the program to explode. We don't want runtime errors. So when you're doing your for loops, you need to be very, very careful about the logic you use. So if I want it to stop when I is 1, but I don't want it to work for I is 0, I need to use a little bit of a different inequality. So if I want to count down 3, 2, 1, I've got the 3, the 2, the 1 going because I started at 3 and I'm decrementing, but I need to change my stopping logic. So I'm going to go into the math, and instead of worrying about a less than value, I'm going to stop it when I is not as big as something. So I'm going to say if I is greater than 0, I'm fine. But then when I reaches 0, I'm not fine anymore. So this is true as long as I is bigger than 0. And then when I gets to be 0, it's not true anymore, and it'll pop me out of the loop. And so when I go ahead and run this, now it's going to count down 3, 2, 1 for me. And sure enough, you can see down here in the console that I get a 3, 2, 1 value. So there you have it. That's the for loop broken down. I've shown you how to basically create something that happens a repetitive number of times. And I've shown you how to go up when doing that. I've shown you how to go down and doing that. And I've shown you that you can start where you want to. You can also increment how you want to. So for example, if I change this to I is equal to 10, and instead of I minus minus, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say I is equal to I minus 3. So now let's think about what the values of I would be. So the first time the loop runs, I is going to be 10. The second time the loop runs, I would be 10. And I didn't put an I in there. I put a 1. I need to make that an I. So 10 minus 3 is 7. And then the next time the loop runs, 7 minus 3 would be 4. And then the next time the loop runs, I would change to 4 minus 3, which would be 1. And then the next time the loop runs, I would be negative 2. And if I kept going, I would be negative 2, negative 5, negative 8, so on and so on. I'm going to keep subtracting 3 each time I iterate. Now, what will this produce? Well, it's going to print out the value of I at each iteration until I is no longer positive, because I greater than 0 is basically a positive number. As long as I is positive, this loop will keep running. When I gets to be less than 0, and that's when it's negative, it won't run anymore. Actually, if I ever got to be 0, it wouldn't run anymore either. So let's go ahead and reset and run this real quick. And you can see down here on the screen, we get 10, 7, 4, 1. So not only can you increment or decrement by 1, but you can choose how you want to increment or decrement. You can choose how the variable is modified. You could make it exponential. You could say I is equal to I times 2. And so now we're talking about 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. I gets really big really quick. So you can do whatever you want to with these math equations inside this for loop if you have a good enough reason about why you would want to do that. All right, so hopefully this has been helpful and you have a better understanding of how a for loop works. Until next time, I want you to keep on creating and keep on coding.